Hello, everyone. How are you doing? And welcome to another episode of the Dr. Will Show, where we have the discussions that inform, entertain, and empower educators to be the change. I am your host, Dr. Will, and I am here today with Dr. Veronica McDermott. How are you doing, Doc?
I am doing very well.
Excellent, excellent. Now, Dr. McDermott came to my attention because I had been interviewing a lot of Corwin authors, and I received this box with a bunch of books. And one of them was your book, We Must Say No to the Status Quo. And so as I was going through it, I was like, okay, this is different. I said, wow. Honestly, I didn't expect it. And so it's very powerful. We're going to get into the book. And I'm using the title of the book for the actual name of this podcast show as well. And people, at the end of this, of course, we're going to talk about the book, but, at the blog post and other things, you'll be able to go to a link where you can actually purchase the book. So I'm very excited. I'm so excited. My words are starting to not come to me right now because this book, when you read it, you'll understand. You will understand. So thank you again, Dr. McDermott, for being on the show. So will you introduce yourself, please?
I will introduce myself the way I normally do when I give a workshop session. There are three things you need to know about me. Number one, I'm a recovering English teacher, which means that I love metaphors. I know what onomatopoeia is, and I can even spell it. Number two, I'm a recovering superintendent, which says a lot about any absurdities that I might be involved in. And number three, when I retired from the superintendency, my husband and I moved from New York. Instead of driving south to Miami, we drove north to Montreal. So I am not your typical person, and these are kind of my foibles. So I think that kind of introduces me in terms of who I am. I'm a lifelong educator. I believe firmly that education is where we need to spend our time and efforts. But I have some questions that I like to use with educators so that we can rethink what we're doing in the world of education so that we can eliminate the marginalization that I see going on all the time. So that's who I am. That's what I'm about. I'm an advocate for social justice. And since I'm retired, I can say things a lot of other people can't say because I'm not dependent upon anybody for a paycheck.
I hear you, because there's certain things I won't say today because I like my check. I got a mortgage. But I'll let you say anything you want to say today. So in reading your book, okay. When did you get woke? And what experiences led to you to see race the way you do in public education?
Well, first of all, I have to say that's probably one of the most challenging questions I've ever been asked, and I love the way you phrased it. Secondly, I want to say from the beginning that my awareness was not a single aha moment. And I think we're foolish if we believe that, all of a sudden, the way we were brought up just disappears in a single flash of insight. And one of the things and as I was thinking about it, that really was the first question that I needed to address when I sat down to write this book. And what I attempted to do was I attempted to take my life experience, bear it out. I mean, I tell it all, the good, the bad, and the ugly, as a means of writing through my experiences to illuminate for others the kinds of possibilities that exist out there. That if you go on this journey, the rewards are magnificent. They're absolutely wonderful. And so in writing the book, I decided to use a metaphor because this thought kept coming back to me as I was thinking about what happened, my journey to become aware. I ended up choosing the metaphor of being in a fog. And this fog is what we grow up with, our personal experiences. And we believe that those things are the norm. We have no reason to believe otherwise. But every once in a while, the fog lifts and you see that there's another world out there. However, it's not permanent. The fog will encase you again because it's just so much more comfortable to stay in your cozy little environment. So what I realized started to happen was, you have two choices when you're in a fog and the fog lifts. You can say, wow, there's a world out there and I want to pursue it. I want to find out what's on the other side. Or you can stay in your comfort zone. And for me, it was very important to get beyond my comfort zone. Once I did that, I began to see vistas and worlds and narratives and life experiences that were diametrically different from anything I had experienced. And then I felt the second part of it, after emerging from the fog, the second part was exposing the flaws in the dominant narrative, because there's this great dissonance that sets in. You know, I had a concept of what life was like and what education was like and what learning was like. And I began to realize that that was only my story, that there were lots of other stories out there. So then it becomes incumbent upon you, if you have any moral or ethical standards, to say, you know what? I have to expose the flaws that are in the dominant narrative. I have to speak out. I have to say something. I have to do something. And then the third phase of it is embracing what that means, what it means to be an ally with others, as opposed to taking over the story. And I'll talk more about that later on. So I saw three things that are not linear by any stretch of the imagination, but kept me going. You know, I would say, wow, I've got something. And then I would make the most incredibly foolish error in judgment or in action. And I'd be encased in that fog once again. So I wanted to make it clear to people that the journey is nonlinear, and it is something that you have to go in with a certain amount of expecting all kinds of getting lost, if you will, being lost in the fog from time to time. In terms of the experiences, I think there were two critical things that became very apparent to me. Number one is, I have yet to meet an educator who doesn't have a big heart. Every educator I know wants to change the world. And I think you probably have experienced that as well. So by disposition, we're inclined to want to do right by others, to want to have a social justice agenda, to want to make sure that every kid that we come in contact with thrives under our care. By preparation, we know how to be strategic. We know how to have a goal in mind and get to it. And thirdly, we have a position that affords us two things. Number one, access to every youngster that comes through the doors of our school. Every single one of them, whether they're gay, Latino, Latina, whether they're Muslim, whether they're Christian, whether they're Black, whether they're white, they are part of our sphere of influence. And because we are educators, even though we often feel that we don't have a lot of authority, we actually have a lot of influence on many people, whether we're in the classroom or we're educators. So I began thinking about that, saying, okay, we've got the goods. We can change the world if we want to. Then on the other hand, I was seeing what I eventually came to call the crime of squandered potential. I saw legions of kids, legions of teachers leaving school. Why? That was very troublesome to me. And in fact, in my view, I felt that the people who left, the students who drop out, the teachers who leave, actually were being exiled. They were being forced to leave because the system refused to bend. The system refused to understand that there's marginalization and that we have to change the way we do things. One of the first ways of changing how we think about education is to shift the focus from teaching and learning, which places the teacher in the power position, to learning and teaching. Because anthropologically, as human beings, we are all programmed to learn. So why is it that kids are leaving our schools? Because I think the emphasis has been more on the wrong. If we think about the potential that we have, the question becomes, how can we harness what we know educators possess, what we know students are hungering for, and eliminate the crime of squandered potential? So that's kind of what led me to think about and to work with the ideas that I worked with in the book. I could go through a laundry list of all of the various people who influenced me, but that was really the crux of the matter. It was an opportunity for me to say, okay, I have these experiences that I think other people can benefit from, and in no small measure, I'd like to start a movement. I think we owe it to ourselves as educators, and certainly to our students.
Okay, you froze for a bit. Hopefully in the playback there won't be that. It won't be there. What was the pain point for you writing "We Must Say No to the Status Quo"?
Another interesting question. If I understand your question to mean what made me uncomfortable, I think there are two situations. One was in reading and researching. I came across, and also rethinking my experiences, I came across two stories that really affected me, that I still have nightmares over. In fact, one is the story that I tell at the opening of the book, which is an encounter that I had with a very well-meaning educator who told me a story about a quote-unquote well-regarded principal who had to leave, who had to retire under a cloud. And the reason was because this principal, who was a principal in a school in the Midwest, in a well-heeled part of town, sponsored, along with his teachers, a quote-unquote slave day. And when I heard that, I was really taken aback, and I said, well, what do you mean a slave day? The educator went on to explain that the demographics were changing, and the teachers in this particular building wanted to sensitize their students to the lives and experiences of some of the new people who were moving into the community. Of course, they did that without consult. Well, I asked the question, did you consult with any of the African American members of your community? Oh, there were none. Any African American teachers? No, there were none. Anybody within the larger Black community? No. And so what ended up happening was there was a tremendous backlash, as should have happened, because this was not their story to tell. And the principal retired, quote, under a cloud, and the teachers swore they would never do anything that had to do with social justice again. So there are so many losers in this story, because you had a group of people who, if they were guided with the right questions, probably could have made ties with the community, learned a lot, put their needs behind the needs of the community. It could have had a whole different ending. So that was the story. That was actually the impetus for writing the book, because so many people tried to get involved in social justice issues. They tried to address race in the United States, and they do it so badly that it has a terrible effect and does more harm than good, separates communities rather than bring them together. The second story was something that I came across as I was doing research. Now that I live in Canada, there's been a tremendous amount of emphasis on truth and reconciliation with regard to our First Nations population here. And these were, for those who don't know, these were residential schools that Christian communities, the church organizations started to, quote unquote, take the Indian out of the First Nations people. So children were forcibly removed from home. They were not allowed to use their language. They were not allowed to participate in their cultural experiences. So it was a cultural genocide, essentially. But one of the stories that I came across that just upset me tremendously was in one of these residential schools, they actually used as a disciplinary means an electric shock that they would administer to a youngster who was misbehaving, however they defined misbehavior. And that depending upon how high that youngster jumped or reacted, they would cheer and hoot. And I thought, this is totally depraved. And it was documented. It's not, I don't understand how people can be cruel like that. So those two stories were very painful moments for me, just thinking through the lost opportunities, the tremendous damage that we do. And I guess the second one was more personal, and I think goes back to that notion of how we can cycle back into that fog, totally unaware we're doing it. It happens to be chapter 5 in my book, where I was trying to talk about the social and psychological toll of marginalization. And as I went back to reread the book, I realized that I had committed one of the major errors that people commit when they're trying to get involved in social justice and equity issues. And that was that I tried to imagine, I tried to connect marginalization, I tried to connect oppression to something I'd experienced. And so I wrote this whole story about my experience as an American English speaker moving to Canada, Montreal in particular, and participating in a French choir, French not being my first language. And trust me, learning a language at my age, a second language at my age, is very difficult. And I had a very uncomfortable experience one day in the choir. I was the only person who spoke English. And I wrote this incredibly wonderful 1,200-word piece about how I now understand oppression. And it dawned on me, once I thought through it, that this is totally incorrect. My experience in a moment of oppression is absolutely not the same thing as people who live with long-term, pervasive, pernicious oppression. And I could walk away anytime. So, you know, to me, I committed a grave error that many people commit in trying to understand, well, what does it mean to be marginalized? We take our experience and we equate it with something that is totally not equatable. They're so different. It overlooks, it dismisses, it minimizes the experiences of people who live with oppression on a daily basis. So that, and so what I decided to do was I decided to explain to my readers that I made this mistake by way of explanation, that it doesn't come easy. And even when you think you think you've read a lot and you've thought through things, you can very easily be suckered into the traps that exist. However, the good message is you can correct it. You can be humble, you can admit your mistake, and you can use it, in my case, as an example of don't get frustrated with yourself. The work is hard, and it's very difficult to undo the way we have been brought up to think and feel and respond. I am not the center of the universe, despite the fact that I want to believe that I am, me and my white middle class perspective. So that was a very humbling moment for me. In fact, I will be honest with you, I almost gave up writing the book because I was so frustrated with myself. And then I said, no, you have to push through this and use it as an example.
Awesome, awesome. Yeah, that first one you wrote, when I read that in the book, I was like, I knew it was going to end badly when I first saw slave. I said, oh, this is not going to. I don't need to read the end of this, but I am, because I know this is not going to end well.
No.
But we find those examples repeatedly happening all over the country with well-intentioned people who, I'm just going to say this, they should know better. And I say they should know better is because these are well-educated people who, in my opinion, should never take on such an endeavor without including the voices and participation of people to even make sure, hey, is this okay? And on our end as Black people, we are tired of our narrative in this country being that of slave. So when people, that's the first narrative people tend to run to is, oh, here's a slave. Instead of saying, well, we had a long, rich history in Africa before coming here. And even after get here and after enduring and surviving slavery, look at what we have been able to create and contribute to this country.
Absolutely.
And those are the narratives that tend to, again, be left out, whether it's an English teacher who has carte blanche over what literature to choose in their classroom, yet they still choose books that don't reflect the cultural experience of their students, when there is a wealth of literature out there written by people of color. But I digress, because I don't want to go there. But it was just those things that when I read that and then hearing you explain it, I those things that come to mind from even our own experiences. I didn't learn anything about myself from K through 12 education.
Absolutely.
I took it upon myself to go to the library, and then once I went to Tougaloo College, which is an HBCU, that changed the ball game for me. And then after that, my whole life has been about, I like to tell people, liberation. So I don't define myself by what other people think I am or what I'm supposed to be. I know who I am, and I know that I have the power to go beyond that, because for me, Black is not a deficiency. Black is my genius. So I take that upon myself to, when I do my work or when I speak, is to make sure that I do the work in an example, and also as a payback to those like my parents who drank from a color-only water fountain, and those before, to make sure that because of what they did, I am today. And so I make sure that I put in the work to repay them as well.
And I think that's our obligation as educators, that we should do that for every one of our children, that they should be proud of where they come from, that they should be challenged to think. I mean, even the term slave day, I've had discussions with people when people want to talk about slavery as the narrative. It's not slavery, it's enslavement. That's a whole different, the choice of words makes such a big difference. And as I've been thinking about the world of education, it seems to me that what you described is what I like to call having every youngster thrive. And I use that expression because I am a gardener. I love gardening. And I defy you to find any gardener who goes out to his or her garden and says, well, I'm only going to have sunlight and water and fertilizer for this group of plants, and the other group of plants I'm going to let just grow on their own. We want all of our plants to thrive. We want them to come to fruition, to flower. And what a different perspective that is than what we tend to think of today about success. Success, of course we want everybody to be successful, but when you have success, you also have failure. Whereas when you think in terms of our role being people who cultivate so that others can thrive, well, that's just has a whole different ring to it. And to my way of thinking, it's probably how your parents raised you. I know it's how my parents raised me. They didn't, they wanted to see the best for me. They wanted me to bloom. And that's what we need to do for all of our students. And we need to, and we are the ones who have to change when we're in charge. If what we're doing isn't working, it's up to us to change, not have the kids change. And I think that's so often what happens. Give them what they need. And what do we all need? We all need the same things. We want to feel good about ourselves. We want to feel good about our heritage. We want to tap our intellectual genius, our capacity, because we all have it. I mean, regardless of the color of our skin, all brains are gray. They're all the same.
Awesome, awesome. So this leads into this is a great segue into the next question. As I was writing this, even though I knew this came from your book, I was going, okay, how do I word this question? White privilege is a touchy subject for many. You know, in your book, you write about white privilege and how its effect on how some teachers view their students. Please define white privilege and explain its impact on teachers and students alike.
Yeah, that certainly is a term that can raise hackles. And again, I could have chosen not to address it, but I felt that I had to. And as I was thinking through the whole notion of privilege, and white privilege in particular, again, a metaphor came to mind. And the metaphor that I chose to use is that privilege of whatever kind it is the invisible ink that writes the life story of those people who happen to be on the top of any strata, whether you're thinking religion, language, I mean, however, any social strata. I mean, as a society, we divide ourselves into all of these categories. And if you have position above others in any one of those social strata, you have advantages. You have things you don't have to think about that are totally invisible, but that dramatically alter your life story. And again, I wanted to broaden the terminology. Certainly white privilege, what I experienced as being a member of the white club, is very different than my two grandchildren who happen to be Black. When people look at them, they are Black children. And I know that they are going to have things to address that I didn't as a member of the white club. Now, as a woman, certainly I had things that operated against me, but I think when you really think about privilege, you understand that in so many different ways, you can either be the top of the heap or you can be the person who's being oppressed, who's being looked down upon, who's being marginalized. And it really has to do with power. Who has the power differential? So how does that impact what happens in classrooms? How does it impact what happens in education? I think we have to be really clear that privilege, power, and politics drive what happens in school. It drives the policies. It drives what materials we read. To use the example that you had used earlier, it drives the practices that we use. And those who are in power, no matter what field, do not want to give it up lightly. And because certain kids thrive in that system, as educators, we tend to think we don't need to make any changes. The power that I see going on right now in schools in North America is an imposition of a business model that has no place in dealing with human beings. What I'm talking about specifically is this tremendous emphasis in the past number of years on measuring students and teachers and on setting up these competitive atmospheres. Now, business may thrive in competition. I don't know. I've never run a business. But I can tell you that human beings, by and large, thrive in atmospheres that are much more cooperative in nature. Now, what happens when you have high levels of competition going on? One of three things will occur. You have one winner, of which there are few. You have losers, of which there are many. And then you have cheaters, of which there are far too many. We see it in the crazy testing frenzy that's been going on, where educators have made very poor decisions, and because their livelihood depends on it, which I can understand, they've made decisions to cheat on tests. Now, to my way of thinking, the policy put them in that position. Their personal errors may have made them make the wrong choice. But why are we putting people in this position in the first place? And so you see that that when we allow the dominant politics and power structures to take over, they influence everything down to what we teach in the classroom. And so I think the questions that we need to ask when something comes out of a state ed department or out of the federal government or out of the Board of Education or out of the mouth of a principal is who stands to win, who stands to lose, whose voice is heard, whose voice is silenced. To what degree does this policy, practice, curriculum choice help all students thrive? And if you ask those questions, you'll have far less of the feeling of marginalization that goes on, and you'll see education change dramatically for all students. But those are the questions we don't ask, and those are the questions that I think we ought to be asking.
So in your book, you wrote about allyhood. What do you mean by being or becoming an ally of students? And what work is involved in becoming an ally for students of color?
Well, it's a much more complicated subject than I thought it was when I started. When I started out, I thought an ally was a very neutral term. It simply meant, working together with others. And then as I began thinking through this and reading, I realized that that in order for you to be a true ally in a balanced situation, you both have to have the same level of power. That power differential comes to play again. And that if you are a person who's a member of the dominant culture and your goal is to work with oppressed people, that power differential is quite obvious from the beginning. I also began to find out that there were a lot of people who are marginalized, or who have been made to feel marginalized, I should say. I should change my wording on that. But there are people who have suffered from oppression who have said, quite frankly, they're done with allies. They've seen that a lot of people who come in with the white savior model are really there for their own personal gain and not really there for the benefit of the people for whom they say that they want to be working with. And that to become an ally is not something that we can self-proclaim. I cannot and should not say I am an ally. Others have to bestow that label on me if I really deserve it. It's not something that I can claim as an identity. In addition, and this is from the work of Mia McKenzie, it is much more than identity. It is action every day, fighting back, speaking out. It's not a static thing that you go, I'm an ally, done. I can add that, I can check that off on my list. I also had a conversation with a phenomenal woman one day who used an expression I had never heard before. She is an African-American Anglican priest and we were at a conference together. And she said at one point during a discussion, "I'm tired of people dining off my people's oppression." And I thought, whoa, that is a powerful statement. And what she meant by that was that oftentimes there are people who do the equity work, but they do it to raise their profile, to win awards, to be looked upon favorably. And that is not healthy allyhood. In the end, I chose to use the word ally, even though there are problematics with it, because it was the best word I could find. And in addition, I came across a definition of a responsible ally from the Anti-Oppression Network, which you can look up online. It's a wonderful, wonderful network of people in Vancouver, British Columbia, who are working on equity issues, First Nations peoples. And they have 6 or 8 attributes of the responsible ally. And I thought, yes, this makes sense to me. I won't read all of them, but some of them have to do with embracing the emotions that you're going to feel during this process. Understanding that your needs are secondary to the needs of the people for whom you're working with. Do not expect rewards. Take direction from the people you seek to work with. This is not my call. It's working with others and standing in the background, waiting to be called upon to use the particular gifts you happen to have that will be used to advance the cause. But it's not your cause, it's the cause of the group of people you're working with. And probably the most important one of all, which is kind of ironic that I'm saying it now after I've spoken so much, listen more, speak less. And those are the kinds of things that will make you into a good ally, because it's a total shift from where you have been positioned in the past. And you'll get frustrated with it on occasion, but that's okay. You'll also grow from it. So to my way of thinking, an ally is working with others, waiting to be called upon to use the particular gifts, influences, ways of doing business that you have that can help the cause.
Awesome, awesome. So what are some of the successes you have seen from the work you've done?
Many, 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 and then again, far, far too few. I wish in my, my dream would be to say there is a school or an entire system or a state that got it right. And the truth of the matter is it doesn't exist. I have seen educational leaders, from superintendents to principals, who have gone out of their way to say that our vision is going to be a vision of equity, and we're going to work real hard on it. I have seen individual teachers in their classrooms really highlighting what it means to be to run a socially just school, if you will. But it doesn't exist in great numbers. There are wonderful pockets of brilliance. There are wonderful organizations that can help. There are groups of people who support each other, but there's lots more work that needs to be done. It is because there are so many people who just don't want to engage, who feel challenged, who fight back because, again, as I said before, people want to remain in their comfort zone. If they're in a position of power, they don't want to give that up. But I'd like to use one concrete example of how just a slight shift can mean all the difference in the world. So we, as educators, one of the things we think about often is how are we going to start out the school year? And I have seen the good, the bad, and the ugly in terms of how that can be done. And so I'd like to start with comparing two ways of looking at how we're going to start out the school year. And I wrote about this in the book because there was an experience that I had that made me say, wow, okay, this needs to be unpacked a little bit. So there was oftentimes teachers want to start out by establishing the classroom climate. Leaders do that as well in terms of having a climate for their building or their school district. However, the question you ask in the beginning is driven by a set of assumptions. There are some messages that are delivered, and then you're going to get a particular result. So let me give an example. Let's say you want to involve your students in creating the rules for classroom behavior. All of us as educators want safe learning environments for our students. So one way you could start out is say, what should the rules of our classroom be? And you think it's a wonderful activity because you have the kids contribute to what the rules should be. But there are unintended consequences in asking that question. The first unintended consequence is that it's built upon an assumption that this group of students needs rules in order to behave, right? Because otherwise, why would you even bother to engage in this activity? The message, of course, is if there's a rule and it's broken, there's got to be consequences. And the result is you put students and teachers in a power struggle situation. If your classroom is rule bound, there are going to be kids who are bound to break the rules. If you rephrase the question from a social justice perspective, and you ask, what does a learning and teaching community look like, feel like, sound like? Let's, as a class, think through that. There are a number of assumptions that are made. Number one, the assumption is that, in fact, we are a community. And the teacher is co-authoring the rules, what this looks like. They're not rules, but co-authoring what this looks like with the students. That the focus is on learning and teaching. And kids know what that looks like, feels like, and they're willing to contribute to it. So the result is very different. The result is not rules and power and authority over others, but it's working together. And it brings in every aspect from how we treat each other, how we talk about each other, what we study. It can be used in every facet, and it can be used as kind of your guidance. You're saying, well, now does this meet the criteria of what a learning and teaching community looks like? And of course, it puts learning first, as I said before, because I think that that's really important. So that's what I think success looks like. In terms of what allies need to do, I think they need to rethink some of the ways of doing things with more of a social justice bent to it. And again, if they keep that notion of what do we need to do to help all children thrive, I think that becomes a good guidepost.
Awesome, awesome. So the last question has a different meaning for me after having a conversation with the teacher. And, she was talking about sort of her experiences and how some people were maybe questioning her decision to teach at a school that was predominantly Black. And she felt, hey, I can do this. I've been doing this. I have this. And she went on to talk to tell me about something that happened. And she said, well, you know how Black grandmas are. And I'm going, huh? Now I know this is a well-intentioned individual.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm wondering, where did that comment come from? Like where in her thought process did she think that was an appropriate comment to make? Like, are all black grandmas the same? Do they all dress alike? Do they all speak the way? So it that comment hit me in a different place that I know she didn't expect it to hit me. Now I didn't have a conversation with her about that. I sort of stood back and said, okay. I didn't laugh. She chuckled, but I didn't. And we finished the conversation, and that was the end of it. So I say that to say, what is your advice for those schools, for those teachers who either see no point in doing any of this, or who have tried and have received backlash because they got it wrong?
We cannot afford to remain silent. Silence is not an option. I think in the case, the situation that you told, your silence was actually an action, because by not laughing along with that comment, you were hopefully getting her to see that that comment was inappropriate. We cannot afford to shy away from addressing the inequities, the microaggressions, the offhanded comments that people make, the policies large and small. We cannot afford to stay silent with on those elements any longer. We have to be strategic, and I think you were strategic in the way that you chose to address this particular situation. You have to be strategic in terms of finding ways to change the conversation, because it's in conversation that the climate of the school changes. It's in conversation that people's eyes are opened. And sometimes the moment isn't exactly when it occurs. I mean, every situation is different. I often find that sometimes you need a little bit of time to think through an appropriate response, and then go back and provide it. Also, I find that when you're dealing with people who are pushing back, the better armed you are with facts, figures, things that are to a large extent indisputable, the better off you'll be. The final thing is that there's a certain social justice terminology, a vocabulary, if you will, that once you become familiar with that, you're able to respond in ways that sound more convincing and more authoritative. But the critical thing is, once you see injustice, you can't unsee it. And the second thing is, silence is not an option. You have to address it in some manner, shape, or form. I wish there were a simple formula. There isn't. Everything is dependent upon your circumstances, your support system, where you stand in the hierarchy. All of those things matter. But silence is not one of the, doing nothing is not one of the options.
Awesome. Thank you again, Dr. McDermott, for being a guest on the show. People, you know how I do. This is going up on my YouTube channel. Please subscribe. I'm going to have this on a blog post where you'll be able to learn how to be able to connect with Dr. McDermott, as well as be able to purchase her book. LinkedIn, Twitter, And you can also be able to listen to this podcast on your way to work, working out, gardening, on SoundCloud and iTunes. So thank you again, Dr. McDermott, for being a guest on the show.
Thank you.
All right, people, as always, invest in you, 80 you, peace.